Thanks everybody for coming. It's really great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. I'm going to read a little bit from two different excerpts from the book Coming About. To give you a little background, Jim and I, my partner in crime and my husband, were living in San Francisco for many years, and we decided we were going to toss it all away, retire, and have a fabulous life in the Caribbean. And we bought a 50-foot sailboat and decided we were going to sail over to our dream retirement in the Caribbean. So the first excerpt is somewhere along the voyage that didn't go quite as expected. We had 4 of us on the boat. It was Jim and I, a hired captain and a hired crew. So this is when things started to go very wrong. All right. Sunday night brought high seas and heavy winds once again. We were still sailing wing to wing with the wind at our backs. It's important to keep a steady course with the sails out in opposite directions. If you allow the wind to get too far to the other side of the sail, the boom would swing all the way around with a loud crash. At about 2 a.m., David was at the helm for his shift. Having completed his time on deck, Jim was just settling in for the night when all of a sudden there was a shattering bang as the boom slammed to the other side. Sonio lurched forward and began to spin in circles. Sonio is the name of the boat. It means dream. The actual name of the boat was Mio Sonio, my dream. Jim leapt up the stairs to complain about David's lack of concentration and carelessness in letting the boom swing around. David exclaimed that he could not steer the boat. Jim took over and realized that the rudder was not responding as Sonio spun in circles in the waves. The sails were flapping in the wind. The lines were getting pulled in all directions. The boom and rigging were banging from side to side, and the clatter was alarming. By this point, we were all on deck trying to figure out what to do. After a number of fruitless attempts to get Sonio under control, we decided to heave to for the night. We could not fix the problem in the darkness with the high seas and the pitching of the vessel. We turned off the engine and left the steaming lights on so that we could be seen if another vessel should come across our path. We bunked down for a fitful night as the waves were pitching the vessel to 30 and 40 degrees. All of the items in the cabin were being thrown back and forth in the cabinets and off of the shelves. Between the rocking of the boat and the items crashing to the floor, we got very little sleep. By 5:30 a.m., we were all up and trying to find a solution to our steering problem. Jim decided that the only way to find out why the helm would not control the rudder was to dive under the boat and inspect the mechanism. That seemed crazy to me, given that we were being tossed around like a beanbag. The seas were still approximately 20 feet, and we could see the stern of the boat bouncing in and out of the waves. He got himself ready with a life jacket and a harness to tether himself to the boat. Then, Jim looked out at the sea and paused. Fear was painted all over his face. "What's the matter, Jim? Are you feeling all right?" I asked. "I can feel my heart beating so hard that I can barely catch my breath." "Slow down, Jim. Just take a deep breath." "My chest is really tight and my head is pounding," he replied. "Okay, stop for a minute. Let's think this through," I said. "Once I dive in, how will I keep steady? There's nothing to hold on to down there." Captain Bob chimed in. "Then how will we figure out what the problem is?" Jim turned to me. "Mario, what if I get in the water, dive under the boat, and it comes crashing down on my head? It could kill me." Then don't go, Jim. The last thing we need right now is for you to get hurt or worse. There's got to be some other way to figure out what's wrong. I agree, but I don't know what else to do, he said. It was not a smart idea to jump off the boat in such high seas. That plan had to be eliminated. The four of us were gathered on deck, and I asked, "So what's the next step?" "Maybe the guy who sold you the boat can give us some advice. Maybe something is jammed and he could talk us through some sort of fix," Captain Bob suggested. I went below to search for his telephone number. Neither of us could remember where it was, so I looked through all of the documentation from the boat. His number was nowhere to be found. After a moment of panic, it dawned on me that it must have been on Jim's cell phone. I hadn't even thought of that, since we had no cell service out at sea. I had to power it up and found it in his recent calls. Jim got the satellite phone and began to dial. We had hoped that perhaps there was something we were missing, that there was an easy fix to the problem. Thankfully, our salesman was in the office, and Jim began to explain the problem. His first suggestion was to dive below the stern and inspect the rudder. When Jim described the dangerous weather conditions, the man said that there was no way for him to know what had gone wrong without more information. He then suggested that we drag large buckets on either side of the boat to provide balance and drag. This wouldn't engage the rudder, but it would prevent the boat from bobbing aimlessly in the high seas. We had 2 kitchen-sized buckets in a locker in order to clean the deck and the hull. With the high seas, there was little chance that this solution would yield the desired results. Jim, who is generally measured and calm, was visibly irritated with him. "So you're saying that you have no idea why we might have lost steering capability, and you have no other solution than dragging buckets? Thanks for your help." And then he hung up. So there we were in the middle of the ocean, without any steering and no solution to the problem. Needless to say, it was a very tense moment. So this was a 50-foot boat, and it was luxuriously appointed, and I was really more concerned about how beautiful the leather was on the seats and how the galley was all set up and how I could cook the food every night. Jim used to call me the galley wench. But the more important part was whether it could function in blue water. And blue water is a term that just means you're sailing in the open ocean, rather than just in Long Island Sound or on a lake somewhere. And boats that are fit for blue ocean travel are more usually heavy duty. This boat didn't seem to fit the bill. So I'm going to read you another passage that takes place later. There's a lot that happens between what I just read you and this passage that I'm going to read you now. The waves were crashing all around me, pushing me further away from the boat. My vision was obscured by the relentless onslaught of white water assaulting me from every direction. I frantically kicked my legs to stay above the surface of the seemingly bottomless ocean. The shoreline was miles away, and I trembled in fear. I struggled to catch my breath as wave after wave struck my face. The taste of salty sea scorched my already dehydrated mouth. I reached in vain for the white plastic garbage bag that was being tossed around like a beach ball in the surf. It contained all of our important documents, all the documents that I had salvaged. I had to get a hold of it. It was difficult to distinguish the shiny plastic from the white, frothy foam of the crashing waves. The bag was almost within my grasp when I was suddenly pulled under. I was disoriented, submerged beneath the tumbling waters. The din of the violent waves was thunderous. I was terrified as I fought against the force of the surf that pushed and twisted my already weakened body. Resisting the impulse to panic, I battled my way back to the top. I needed air. I gathered my remaining strength and propelled myself through the tumult. I pierced the surface and gasped as oxygen filled my burning lungs. Letting go of the boat to retrieve that plastic bag had been foolish. I was in the midst of the turbulent waters of the coral reef, without a life jacket, fighting to stay afloat. I had lost sight of the bag and was desperately scanning for it when it popped up after having been submerged. This time, I managed to grab a hold of it. At least we had our passports and the little cash we had brought with us. But at that moment, I felt no relief. Rather, an irrepressible anger welled up within me as I looked up at the gray sky. "What the hell have you done to us?" I screamed. It was an incredibly irrational response to the circumstances I found myself in. I didn't cry or even feel particularly relieved. Instead, I erupted in anger towards God. How could he have let this happen to us? My worst nightmare was coming true. We were miles from the shore, getting pummeled into the coral reefs. My body began to shake as I felt my childhood fear of the open ocean welling to the surface. Would we survive? Barely keeping my head above water, I used my free arm to battle my way back to the dinghy, all the while seething with anger. How did we end up here? What possessed us to leave San Francisco? We had successful jobs, a beautiful home, and a community of friends whom we loved. The plans we had for our future were grand. We traveled extensively, and every country we visited held some allure. We would fantasize about what it would be like to live in Italy or Ireland or Spain. I joke of leaving it all behind and starting a new adventure in some faraway location. On our most recent vacation, the beauty of the Caribbean had seduced us. The sun's rays sparkled on the clear blue water. Sailing from island to island and feeling the warm breeze caress our faces, there seemed to be no downside to living in that part of the world. After years of fantasizing about retiring in an exotic destination, we took a leap of faith. Now, our lives, our survival, hung in the balance as we fought in the beautiful waters that had drawn us to the Caribbean. Their beauty had beguiled us into leaving everything behind in order to live in a tropical paradise. How could it all have gone so wrong? So, let me take a sip of water. So, the book has much more in it, but do you have any questions about it, about the journey or about the writing, about our experience? All of this, yes?
I can't believe you got back on the boat.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I do in this is I definitely take ownership of my poor decisions, my poor choices. That's why I say at the end of every ethics class, make good choices, don't I? Yeah. I loved sailing. We loved sailing, and sailing in San Francisco on the bay was like an adventure every single time we went out. The wind was so strong. It wasn't like sailing on Long Island Sound here, where sometimes in August there's nothing. You got a motor just to get a little breeze to get the mosquitoes off of you. But after it happened, and there were two parts to the story, and I don't want to give too much away. But one of the important things for me was to get on the boat again because it was so traumatic. Our friends in St. Thomas were tremendous. They took us all in after, and one of our friends had a 50-foot boat and said, "Listen, you guys are coming on a boat with us. We're gonna sail to Puerto Rico." And I was like, "No, we're not. no, we're not." And Jim was all for it. He had a different reaction to it, and I can't speak for his, but I thought, well, it's going to be very different. The experience will be very different from sailing in the open ocean where you can't see anything for miles and miles and miles except gray water. And the water really does look gray out there if there's not a pure blue sky. The Caribbean is so beautiful. So we did get on a boat, and it was fine. It was really okay. I was like, all right, I can do this, and I knew enough about sailing. We were good sailors, and even though the friends of our dearest friends from college have children who never will get on a boat with us, sitting over there, but it felt just fine. And it was an important step for me because afterwards we did have a boat here in Long Island Sound for many, many years and sailed without the trauma. So, yeah. Yeah.
When did you decide to write the book?
That's a good question. Thank you, Yugar. So every year, the seniors, I teach at Marymount School, and the seniors go on retreat. And one of the things that I do, I don't want to give too much away because some of them are here and some students are here. I give a talk that has to do with transitions, basically, and things that affect us and point us in different directions. And I tell a very small portion of the story on the retreat. And every year, the reaction I got from the girls was so profound, and they would ask me more and more questions about it and what I learned about it. And, they wowould say, you have to write a book. This would make a great movie, and, I'd be like, yeah, that's great, And it was interesting that for me, this happened in 2001 and 2002. It wasn't just one event. It was, you have to read the book to figure out the rest. But, it was a very difficult time in our country. And, I kept thinking, there has to be something that I'm supposed to learn from this. And 2002 turned into 2003, and then 4, and then 5. And I was like, I still don't know why all this awful stuff happened. And until I could figure that out, there was no book to write. I was still living the trauma. So, and I think, honestly, in giving the talk each year on retreat later on, I began to learn my lesson. I began to make sense out of what happened to both of us, and it needed to come out. I needed to get some clarity, And one of the ways I get clarity is by writing my thoughts. I've been journaling since I was in college. And so much of the book, I mean, the details that are in here come right from my journal. I mean, I usually bring it with me to book talks, but I didn't want to risk losing it. It looks all stained from the water that when it was submerged, and some of the writing is completely obscured, faded away. But in that journal, as I was writing the book, were all the details. So I wrote the book to make sense out of something that didn't make sense.
Can you talk about the writing process? How what choices you had to make, how to start, how to, construct it, how to, what's the geography or the geometry of the book.
Yeah.
What kind of choices you had to make, leave out.
Exactly. Thank you. It's interesting for me, having never written a book, I started this in 2013. By then I was like, okay, I think I can do this. So, and I sat down and I started at the very beginning and figured at some point I'd get to the end. And I just kept getting stuck. I just couldn't get through it. And I just stopped. And I think it wasn't until I wrote my doctoral dissertation that gave me a sense that I could actually write. And I have a colleague, Dr. Boykin, who sat next to me all the time. And as I was writing the dissertation and struggling through the process of hundreds of pages of writing, she was like, "Yeah, don't look for the perfect word, don't look for the perfect phrase, and don't start at the beginning. Just write whatever is in your head at that moment, and just write." And I say that to you guys, don't I? When you're writing papers for me, I'm like, just write what's in your head. Go back later. Go back later, and you can read that and throw it out, or read it and put it in order, and take each of these little pieces and put the timeline together. And that's what I did. I just started writing whatever was in my heart at that time. And I have to be honest with you, like some of the more difficult parts of the book, I didn't write till the very end. And they were very detailed. I had, right after these things happened to me, I was journaling like crazy. So all I had to do was take that, and put it into a narrative. But it just wasn't there for me. So one morning, and I was very disciplined. I would write every morning. I'd get up, take a shower, go to the gym, take another shower, have my coffee, and then just sit. And I would write for hours, but I wouldn't just do it at one sitting. I'd get up, go take a walk outside, come back. But a lot of the stories or pieces of the story were not created all at once. Like I would come back to it the next day or 2 hours later and look at it and yeah, I'm done with that part. There's no more juice from the lemon to squeeze. I'm done. And I would just start with another thing that was in my head. Mowing the lawn was a good time. I would mow the lawn. I live out in White Plains, and I would be doing that and I'd be like, I forgot about that part. And then I'd run back in, leave the lawnmower there, and just start typing for another 2 hours. And then by the end of the summer, I wrote most of the first draft. I wrote all of the first draft over one summer. And then I had to organize it. And it took a long time to put it in an order that was cohesive. Because what ended up, the product that ended up before me was a bunch of different stories. And somehow I had to connect them. But that was easier in a certain respect. Not letting myself get stuck was an important thing. You don't have to finish this part right now. You could just get up and get a drink of water. You can go up and go somewhere and come back to this, and you will have another thought. And I did. And I had some more to say. But the thing is, after I read it, like that's another thing, is going away from it for a few days and then coming back. And it's like, oh, that's terrible. And just rewrite a phrase, or I found the perfect word later. And sometimes like, oh, this is really good, but I know what happened, but a reader's not going to know anything about what I was thinking here. But the other thing then, once I did put it in order, I mean, the writing process, it was getting some other eyes on it. And I was very fortunate to have a bunch of colleagues that were able to read it, and friends who were like, yeah, let me see it. And to be critical enough to say, yeah, I don't know what you mean here. Or this sounds really intense, but how did you get here? Can you explain this a little bit more? And Jim was a big part of the writing process, even though he, he hasn't read it yet. But I forced him in a 5-hour drive. He was captured.
It was read to me.
Yeah, I read him. Yes, I read him the book, and along the way he'd be like, that particular detail about sailing isn't accurate, or giving me some good criticism that would help me to make it more clear. Sometimes I can be a little verbose. So a good copy editor is essential. I'm like, yeah, you say this already. You don't need to say this again. You don't have to say this again in different language. Or can't you just say, I don't know, can't you just say we stopped sailing? Do you have to say, a really long phrase for the same kind of thing? You don't, so. It took 7, 8, 9 versions before it came to fruition, and then I was like, I'm done. I can't look at this anymore. Yeah. So yeah.
What does it feel like to relieve the emotion, and all the little details? Now you have to be very detailed about it.
Yeah. That's another really good question. It's interesting. When I give the talk on the retreat, there was one portion that I didn't read you tonight, specifically because I knew that there were going to be girls from Marymount here. When I read it, I relive it. And it's pretty much I shouldn't say the only, but one of the few moments that I still feel my heart beat as if I'm still there. And it's very difficult. Reliving it in the writing process gets some of that emotion out of it. The more you look at it to edit it, the more you look at it to clean it up, to proof it, the more it becomes distant. And so reading parts of this tonight were not difficult, but there are times when I'm in the middle of a reading where it hits me, and I'm like, oh, this didn't hit me last time. And tonight, that first part, the second reading I did, where I'm grasping for the boat and come up out from the surface and trying to take my first breath, and that burning in my lungs, I felt that tonight. And so you just don't know how it's going to hit you, But like I said, in the process of writing and proofing, you get a little distance, and the distance is important in telling a good story. Yes.
So if you could kind of give some of your wisdom to a young, aspiring writer, what would you say to a young person that wants to get into doing what you do?
Well, keep writing. You have a lot of stories, like all of us have a lot of stories. And I think don't let any publisher or any teacher or any professor tell you can't write. but be open to the constructive criticism that you'll get along the way. I think for me, it was important not to get my feelings hurt when somebody said, I don't understand what you're trying to say here, or this is really cumbersome, this is awkward. You know, if it's awkward, then we have to look at it. And I think as a writer, we have to accept criticism for our writing. But just because you get the criticism doesn't mean that you cannot write, and doesn't mean that you should stop. And then the other thing is that you should continue to write whatever story's in your heart. I would say the first thing you should do as a young writer or an older writer is to journal. Write down whatever's in your head at any time. It doesn't have to be part of a book that you're actually planning or an article that you're actually planning to write right now. Write those thoughts down. Keep a journal of thoughts, a journal of ideas that you could go back to and add to. Since I wrote this, I do that all the time. Like, it's not, like, I have 3 books going on at the same time now, actually 4. But, you know, it's like this much of a book, you know, but it's like it's in my head and I have to get it out and I write. And I may not revisit that for a very long time. So I would say you continue to write and develop a thick skin. You know, you just have to do what you love. You know, you have to follow your passion. So if writing is your passion, you have to write. You know, if singing is your passion, you have to sing. And there's always going to be somebody who tells you you're not good enough. But if you don't do it anyway, then you're the one that's going to suffer. You know, so write. Get criticism, write. Submit it, get rejected. Submit it, get rejected. Submit it, get rejected. Publish. So, any other questions? Anything about, I am writing other books now. I'm writing a book about my mother and father. That's going to take me a long time, actually. But she is 87 and a half years old at this point, and she tells lots and lots of stories and has been telling them forever. So it's going to be called Letters from Italy, because she just gave me the letters that she and my father written to each other from Italy to New York City, and they're all in Italian, and I transcribed them and writing their stories. So that's going to take me a bit of time. And then I'm launching into my first trial of fiction. I've got a book that's in its copy editing phase, second copy editing phase, and that's a coming-of-age story of a young Catholic boy coming to terms with being gay and being Catholic, wanting to be a priest, being Catholic, you know, and then another story of seminarians going off to Rome. So I'm writing basically things that I know, different parts of my life, and creating characters out of those parts of my life that are very rich in stories. So.
Well, we're going to look for.
Yeah, we got one more question. Yeah.
What was it like writing a book about something so personal?
So the question was, what was it like to write a book about something so personal?
You mean this one? Okay. So Zaina, that's so when I finished it, when I finally decided it was done, and I was ready to send it off and upload it, I had one of the biggest panic attacks of my entire life. And it was basically because it was so personal. You know, when you write something like this, anytime you write something, even if it is fiction, you're exposing yourself. You're incredibly vulnerable. You know, and something that's nonfiction, I tell a lot of my own personal struggles in here. You know, that's not very easy. And I think it was just my need to have the story out there, that I believed that the story had a message. And the message went beyond me and my being uncomfortable sharing personal details. You know, and even with writing this fiction that I'm almost done with, you know, there's still a lot of me in there. Like when you develop a character, you know, what you think about people comes out in your characters, right? So, yeah, you've got to get used to being vulnerable. But that's the only way to do things in life, right? One of the ways you learn to love another person is by exposing your heart to them. So if you don't let yourself be vulnerable, you won't let yourself be loved. Same thing with writing.